clients on any or all of practice management consulting, credentialing, provider enrollment, coding audits, provider education, pre-authorizations, and of course, our core service is billing and collections. We work with over 150 clients across the country, including one of the largest academic-based physician practices in the country. So let's start by talking about the 20,000-foot perspective and events in the industry and market that continue to create challenges for independent physician practices. So in December last year, Medical Economics released an article on the top challenges for independent physician practices. Because each of these can occupy their own webinar series, let's just highlight some of the frustrations to set the stage for why an internal assessment is so important when the external environment is putting increasing pressure on providers and practices. The common theme when you look at the top part of this list that includes MACRA, prior authorizations, payer negotiations, and maintenance of certifications is that it all involves more overhead to practices. First on the list is MACRA. A few years ago, we were trying to feel our way around in the dark with meaningful use, and there was a lot of discussion about ACOs and shared savings reimbursement models and pay for performance with payers. Depending on where you are in the country, these programs either provided great opportunities to leverage the use of electronic medical records and receive additional funds, or it further demonstrated that the quality imperative has not yet arrived. I can tell you that in our local market in Louisville, Kentucky, we're behind the 8 ball here. So while we had a lot of buzz about ACOs and meaningful use, not a lot of that came to fruition, and we're still struggling locally with systems being able to talk to each other and interfaces across both hospital and practice platforms. So today we have MACRA with MIPS and APM and other new acronyms to achieve quality metrics. I'm not going to focus on this today, but you know, we're all well into the third quarter. So as we think about an internal practice assessment, you know, one of the main questions is, you know, where are you achieving the road to meeting MACRA requirements? Do you even know if all of your providers are required to report? We work with some practices where some providers are being required to report, whereas others are not. And even within that, we're reporting on different measures due to the composition of our practices. Our Director of Clinical Analytics, Carrie Wing, has presented a number of webinars on MACRA readiness, and we can share links to those sessions for anyone interested. Prior authorizations, driven by cost and utilization management, prior authorizations have increased significantly for both drugs and procedures. This is a painful process that, depending on the size of your practice, may take a 0.5 or maybe even a 1.0 full-time equivalent to manage. For a number of specialty practices we work with, prior authorization is now built in to the service we provide because it impacts the revenue cycle process greatly. And so much like credentialing and provider enrollment, if you don't get prior authorization right, you're not going to get paid. Electronic health record interoperability. So remember when all medical practices were supposed to get electronic medical records and how much easier our lives are going to be because all the systems talk to each other? Well, I just alluded to that, and yeah, it hasn't quite happened, and it has yet to happen. And while interface is easy enough to say, the cost and complexity of an interface is a challenge. Even before talking about interfaces and interoperability at a more basic and functional level, we work with practices across the country to help them use basic functions and further just optimize the use of their existing electronic medical record. We see a lot of workarounds using EMRs when we should really be looking for ways the technology should work for us. And then we have patients, all grouped into this, these 4 items here, kind of bucketed into this blue highlighted category. So we know them well because we're guilty of being those patients, right? We complain about costs, we complain about wait times, we Google diagnose ourselves, and we hope our physician will call in a prescription, and then we complain. So we asked for patient engagement, and now we have it. We're going to talk a little bit about that in a few minutes because that is key in terms of thinking about your internal practice and how you're managing those patient interactions. So as overhead and regulatory requirements rise, provider morale and motivation to continue on as a business owner is driven downward. Providers want to focus on their patients, and as business owners, they need to know where they stand as a practice. They're good about encouraging their patients to have annual wellness checkups, but what about an annual checkup for their practice? An internal practice assessment helps create a baseline for the practice and can really drive new processes and services and strategies. So today we're going to cover these areas in terms of completing a practice assessment. We'll talk about approaches and what to do with the information, as well as some additional strategies and even next steps to take action on these areas. So a market assessment. So as much as when you think about a market assessment, it's very much taking stock of the external environment. We're collecting and analyzing information that will really help contribute to changes to the practice operations and really help make sure the group remains competitive. So while you have an idea of where your patients come from, it helps to verify this data with information from your practice management system. So based on patient visits, you want to identify the zip codes that 75% of your patients come from. This traditionally defines your primary service area. If you're doing this for the first time, this will serve as your baseline. You can use population statistics from the census website to look at population projections for your top zip codes. Should you expect to see growth in the next 5 to 10 years, or perhaps a decline, or maybe population stats are flat and stable. Also, to what degree will you see these changes? And so by looking at patient origin and future projections, you can plan to ensure the practice is right-sized for the future. A competitor analysis is also important to the market assessment. Besides the obvious of wanting to know who you're competing with, creating a spreadsheet of your competitors and listing out locations, services, providers, and hours of operations will clearly show how your practice compares in accessibility as well as experience. Defining the competition's ownership structure is important as well. In addition to independent and hospital-owned, there are more super groups that are emerging. These are smaller independent practices that come together to share risk and function under one tax ID as basically a practice without walls. Their size allows them to negotiate improved reimbursement, participate in payer quality programs, and also helps improve their buying power. So step one, putting together a market assessment, actually plays directly into the next area of focus, which is payer contracts. So one of the first questions we ask practices when engaging with them for consulting or billing services is to provide copies of their payer contracts for their top 5 payers. Oftentimes, copies cannot be located, nor can a practice manager tell me the last time a contract was signed or renegotiated. If you're guilty of this, you're definitely not alone. Creating a payer contract management spreadsheet to include critical contract points is really important. You want to fill in the blanks for your payer rep and their contact information. You want to include the percentage of charges for each payer, so basically what they contribute to your payer mix. Include the contract start date, the initial term date, the term of the contract, whether it's an evergreen agreement that renews each year, and what's the notification period to actually cancel a contract. Within this spreadsheet, add in the cause and no cause termination clauses. This could be important in the event there's an ongoing payer issue that remains unresolved and could create grounds for termination with cause. Newer contracts also have specific language regarding a merger or acquisition of a group. I worked with a group that was 8 independent practices that came under one tax ID and had over 40 providers. When I started to evaluate the payer contracts, I discovered there were 18 fee schedules for one payer because this particular payer was contracted with both individual providers and or the old group tax IDs. The language in those contracts indicated that a new group contract would not be considered until there was a notice period provided for each of the existing contracts, and that was nearly a dozen contracts. So a year later, it took about a year after all notices were provided to stop the contracts from renewing, we were able to finally set a new contract in stone with one fee schedule. But it's a process, and you need to understand that as you're thinking about future plans for your practice in terms of mergers and acquisitions and what becomes of your payer contracts. And basically, this is just a reminder that, check the language, see what you'll be held to if you merge with another practice or become acquired. And then finally, do some research and find out what each payer asked for and received from the State Department of Insurance in terms of rate increases. Often this makes the news, the local news, but if a payer is asking for a 15% increase from the state and potentially gets a 10% increase, a 1 to 2% inflationary increase on my practice's rates is not going to cut it. And I'm going to use that information I know about what they asked for and received from the state to argue for more. So while the legal terms of the contract are important, what's more important is the fee schedule associated with your payer contract. Basically, what are you contracted to be reimbursed by the payer? So here's an example of a spreadsheet that every practice should have. This is just a snippet of one of them from one of our groups. Here's for your practice's top 75 to 100 CPT codes. Be sure you have your contracted reimbursement rate for each payer consolidated to a spreadsheet. For the codes here, you can see payer 3 has much higher reimbursement than the other payers. The immediate thoughts that come to mind to consider are, how do I attract more patients with this insurance? Or perhaps what more can I do with this payer to demonstrate quality and earn incentive bonus on top of the higher rates they're already offering? Or how do I negotiate my other commercial rates to get closer to payer 3 rates? When it comes to renegotiating contracts, this information is critical. You'll need to know where you are today as it relates to a percentage of Medicare allowable and what you're asking for across the entire fee schedule, or perhaps carve-outs of the fee schedule for codes that are important to your specialty. And so while rates are important, what also factors into this obviously is volume or units of service for each of the rates. You don't want to fight, you want to go and fall on your sword for a higher rate on a code that you use less than 5 times a year. So if there are cuts in rates or lower levels of increases, move those to low volume codes and focus efforts on those codes that are basically the bread and butter of your practice. In more recent negotiations, a payer will tell me I can only offer 2.9% across the board or 5% across the board. And if you apply that, directly in terms of rates, you are better off, with carve-outs if your payers will allow that, especially again on those bread and butter codes. Also, your practice needs a story. So, while it's true that you won't get anything if you don't ask for it, the ask should really be accompanied by how your practice is different. So going back to that market assessment, you want to take that information to show payers that, one, you understand your local competition, that hopefully you have more experience, more accessibility, and you want to offer to work with the payers on metrics that are important to them because they're interested in continuing to inform, their risk adjustments and analysis as well. So again, showing and demonstrating your story and taking that to the payers to show why the rates that you're asking for should be granted. So we all know charges in healthcare are inflated and that collections will only be a percentage of charges. But remember that payers are only going to pay you the lesser of your charges or contracted rates. So let's take a look at this payer fee schedule comparison again. For code 20550, if I set my charge at 200% of Medicare, my charge would be about $111. When I send my claim out to payer 3 with a charge for $111, do you know how much I'm going to get paid? I'm going to get paid $111, even though I'm contracted to receive $131.70. Again, payers are only going to pay you the lesser of your charge or the contracted rate. So it's important to review your contracted rates, evaluate them as a percentage of Medicare allowable, and then set charges to ensure you're not leaving any money on the table with your payers. Typically, we set our client fee schedules at a minimum of 200% of Medicare. But again, with this particular client, when we see that we have a code that's paying, well, a payer with a code that's paying above 200% of Medicare, those are our carve-out rates that we do increase to a higher level. So speaking of leaving money on the table, when was the last time you audited EOBs against your contracted rates? While we would love to trust our payers, always get their contracts loaded properly, and always process our claims properly, it is always helpful to check and just to make sure, right? Trust but verify. So each quarter, you should pull about 20 EOBs for your top 3 to 5 payers and compare what you receive on the EOB against your spreadsheet of contracted rates that you put together. And do this quarterly to ensure that any underpayments, which is usually what we focus on, or overpayment errors are discovered and corrected quickly, so future claims and cash flow are not negatively impacted. Both underpayments and overpayments, could result, obviously on the overpayment side, in recoups later on, and we certainly don't want that to impact cash flow in the future. Another reason to do this quarterly is that payers may change their reimbursement or update their reimbursement due to changes in the average wholesale price for pharmaceuticals, and that AWP is adjusted quarterly or every 6 months, just depending on when your payer receives that information. So when conducting this audit, it may indicate a need to update charges on the master fee schedule for any reimbursed rates that are getting close to what you're charging for that actual service. So staffing and workflow. Doing things the way they've always been done is not necessarily a recipe for efficiency. Workflow and patient flow in your office is essential to practice success. So when was the last time you reviewed each functional area of your practice? So asking questions and documenting job responsibilities, tasks, and workflows can in and of itself shed light into some areas that can be improved by reassigning work or providing some additional staff training. We always try to implement cross-training when available, and especially in our small practices, that's going to be important, as there will be individuals that are out for one reason or another, and others that'll need to cover. Additionally, having key employees or even all of your employees complete a SOAR analysis to identify strengths, opportunities, aspirations, and results. From their perspective, it reinforces employee engagement and also allows them to kind of contribute to the process of planning and helping improve the practice. So if you recall, if you know, employees often have answers to questions. You just haven't asked those questions yet. So conducting an analysis such as this gives them an opportunity to express feedback. And the structure of a SOAR analysis is really to build on strengths, which is much easier than often digging out and trying to build and fix problems or perceived weaknesses. So strengths, what can the practice continue to build on? Opportunities, what are our stakeholders asking for? So, what is the shared vision of the practice? Are we patient focused, and what are we trying to do in that sense? What do we care deeply about? Do we have a strong culture with our coworkers, our physicians? Do we have a good work environment? And how do we know that we are succeeding? And so again, helping facilitate these questions and answers help into the planning process of each of our practices. So patient satisfaction and engagement. So the buzzword patient engagement made its way into our industry several years ago. And patients today are more engaged, and sometimes in ways that creates challenges to our practices. Traditional patient satisfaction surveys provide good insights to how patients perceive the quality of care received, as well as how attentive staff was to their needs. Several years ago, a standardized patient survey called HCAHPS was released, and since then, a database of comparative information has been developed for practices to compare themselves to either similarly sized practices or same specialty practices. So if you're conducting patient satisfaction surveys, it's also beneficial to understand how you compare to others, as payers are starting to look at this information and potentially use this to determine future reimbursement rates. But what about informal patient ratings? I think you've all seen them. Every time you go and Google the phone number for your physician, you'll see something maybe from HealthGrades or WebMD, Facebook, even Angie's List. All of these services now have rating systems that are driven by patient comments and oftentimes detailed experiences, both positive and negative. So when was the last time you Googled your providers? As part of reputation management for the practice and understanding patient perceptions, it's a good idea to conduct an internet search of each of your providers and your office. While we're always hopeful that there's nothing but positive feedback, you'll always have to take in the negative feedback and start to work to address issues. And those issues have to be addressed privately within the office with a particular provider, with particular staff members. And you also need to have a strategy in terms of how to address the feedback publicly. So a number of these sites provide ways for providers and businesses to respond to the feedback, and you should take advantage of them so the voice of the practice is also expressed. Engaging patients proactively is an even better strategy to highlight positive patient experiences and drive referrals. If you have a Facebook site, be sure it's managed and updated with information, as well as calls to action for patients to come in for either their annual well check, flu shot clinic, a method of introducing new services, extended office hours, whether or not you have new providers that you want to introduce or new staff members. Just like Facebook helps keep friends and family close, it's doing the same for medical practices and businesses by keeping patients and customers engaged through information sharing. But at the end of the day, practices need cash. They need cash and healthy revenue to survive. So billing companies, accounting firms, consultants, we at iHealth, where we have a ton of data and information and reports that we provide to our offices. Most physicians and practices flip through reports. They look for those 3 to 5 key numbers to focus in on. And we call those numbers key performance indicators. And knowing them and how they compare to historical values gives us either a quick reassurance that things are going okay, or it sets off an alarm in the event that there are issues with the revenue cycle, potentially something wrong with the payer contract or credentialing, maybe something got hung up in the clearinghouse, but it certainly gives us an opportunity to see very quickly that there may be an issue and then to go and identify it. So the KPIs that I like to have on hand include total charges, collections and adjustments by provider, and as well as for the group as a whole. This shows me seasonality as well as trends and expectations for coming months in terms of collections. The gross and net collection percentages demonstrate how well the billing team is doing with collections. Ideally, net collections will trend towards 100% as it's an indication that the team is collecting everything they can. Gross collections is simply collections divided by charges and should be looked at as a trend. So rather than just take 1 month of data and make a judgment on it, I'd want to see it over time. So as I mentioned before, for most of our practices, we set a master fee schedule at a minimum of 200% of Medicare allowable. But depending on the payer mix and the contracts, the gross collection percentage should trend close to 50%. When these numbers are produced using date of service reports, you'll see them increase over time, and that's just an indication that the AR is maturing as you collect back to those dates of service when the services were provided. Charges and collections per visit are always good to review when comparing providers. If charge per visit varies significantly between providers, it's worth a dive into the provider-specific CPT codes to see what one provider is doing that the other is not, especially if you know your practice and you know that your providers, function very much the same way. It very well could be a documentation issue within the EMR. So while provider A may be documenting everything that he or she should be doing, maybe only part of that's getting captured on the actual claim and not getting out the door. So it's always worth a look to compare providers against each other. Of course, internal data is good to have, and you can create your internal benchmarks, but having comparative benchmarks is even better. MGMA remains the gold standard of benchmark data. It's we purchase it annually, and we look at our practices against MGMA numbers, everything from RVUs to the KPIs that you see listed here. At least those are available. Tracking and trending your payer mix is also important. While it's not likely that major payers in your market will change, practices should monitor the influx of Medicaid managed care plans, as well as potentially exchange plans to track changes in reimbursement. And finally, I like to run an age trial balance by payer weekly to review buckets of aging AR by payer. It's also helpful to look at the patient AR on its own and make a determination of what's collectible versus uncollectible. If you have capacity in your office and the right personality, I want to reemphasize the right personality, have someone within the office focus on patient AR and call on balances to be sure it doesn't get so old that you end up having to write it off as bad debt. But tracking that weekly is certainly helpful so that, when you run it 6 months from now for the first time, you're not blown away by just how large some of the numbers are within the 120 or the 180-day bucket. And so while we focus a lot on revenue, don't lose sight of the other side of the equation. Aggressive expense management also contributes its fair share to the bottom line. So while the largest expense item on the financials is salaries and wages, malpractice premiums is often the second largest or the next biggest ticket item on the expense side for practices. Medical malpractice policies typically renew annually, so about 3 to 4 months ahead of renewal. It's worth going to other carriers and asking for quotes. I had the opportunity to work for a group with about 50 plus providers, and even as the group grew from the prior year, when I opened up their malpractice premiums for bid, we were able to realize about $100,000 savings just by switching malpractice carriers. And it was simply, creating a competitive environment, and there were enough bidders out there that wanted a group that large to cover. Also, if you are not participating in a group purchasing organization, you should definitely consider that to see what additional savings may be available. Oftentimes, you may not have to change distributors, but the contract pricing under a group purchasing organization or GPO is more competitive because they are negotiated based on the buying history of the entire group. And that's often made up of several hundred providers, if not thousands, but several hundred providers and practices. So beyond table paper and tongue depressors, GPOs also have relationships with other vendors, including biohazard waste removal services, supplies and reagents for your in-house lab units, office supplies, and even employee discounts on cell phone service. Finally, you should evaluate the cost of your service expenses and simply ask for discounts. It's a competitive market, and vendors know businesses have options, so it never hurts to call and ask for better pricing on everyday services. It's oftentimes just a small investment in time, and very well could add something to the bottom line. So in summary, independent practices continue to be under enormous pressure from the external market, and that really creates even a greater need to evaluate your internal processes. There are a lot of steps here, a lot of items to collect information to process, but if you're related to any or all of these pain points, this gives you a framework to start your assessment. Of course, the iHealth team is here to help beyond our core service of billing and collections. We're working with clients on operational and clinical projects to ensure long-term viability. Thank you for joining me today on the webinar. We'll open up the phone lines and review the chat for questions.
Thank you, Belinda. I want to thank everyone for joining as well, and wanted to apologize for my technical issue at the beginning of the call. Wouldn't let me share the voice line for some reason. But the chat is open, so I will monitor questions for the next couple of minutes. And please feel free to just enter them in.
Hey, Stacy, is the phone line open for questions as well? Or just coming through
The
chat?
phone line is not, but through chat,
Okay.
or through the questions box, correct.
Great. All right.
I'm not seeing anything come through. But if you want to go ahead and take Belinda's information down, if you'd rather just ask your questions to Belinda directly, feel free to do that as well. I'll leave the line open for another minute just to see if anyone has any final questions. Okay, we do have a question that came through. So, Belinda, the question is, can you please clarify the lesser of two charges contract language that you explained earlier?
Sure. So you said a master, you obviously have your master fee schedule that you set in-house as what you charge out on all your claims. If you set that fee to anything less than what your contracted rate is, you will only get paid what you charge out. So if you're doing a 99213 for $100 and your payer is actually contracted to pay you $120, because you only charge out $100, they're only going to pay you $100 for that procedure code.
Thank you, Belinda.
Sure.
And for all those still on the line, Belinda does have one blog out there on the iHealth Innovations website regarding this topic that you can also take a look at. And then we will have another one shortly after this webinar, as well as a link to this webinar. Okay, I don't see anything else coming through, so I'd like to thank you again, Belinda, and conclude our webinar for today. Thank you all for joining.
Great. Thank you very much. Have a great day.